Hi, I'm Miss Pliskin, and today I'm building the Victorian mansion from season 4 of Stranger Things. No worries, this video is spoiler-free, and I'm sure I'm not the first simmer to build this beauty. It's such a gorgeous house, but hopefully I can tell you some stuff you might not have known about the real-life mansion, give you some insight into the architectural style and its trademarks, and babble on for a bit about late Victorian houses and history. Okay, let's get into it. First of all, the house in Stranger Things is based on a real-life house called Claremont House, which is located in Georgia. It looks like up until recently, the house was a bed and breakfast, but was sold, and this is good news for us since that means there are recent real estate listing photos of the interior available online. They must have filmed in the house or reproduced the interior sets because the interior of the house is remarkably similar to what's shown in the show. To avoid spoilers, I don't show any screenshots of the show in this video, but I will be referencing those real estate listing photos, and I also found a couple of really old photos that I want to show you that show exactly how this house would have looked when the original family lived there. Speaking of the original family, the house was built in 1882 for Colonel Hamilton Yancey, and I am not sure why they called him Colonel, because he was not a colonel, he was a lawyer. And both him and his family were very involved and very influential in local and national politics. And obviously they were quite well off in order to be able to afford such a grand mansion. I don't know how much it cost in 1882 to build this thing, but in 2019 it sold for just $350,000. That is insanely cheap. This is a 6-bedroom, 7,000 square foot mansion. I think maybe the reason for the low selling price is it might need a lot of work. It looks a little bit rough around the edges in the real estate photos. It probably needs a new roof, and the kitchen looks like it hasn't been updated since the 80s. Plus, its location is a little out of the way, and that probably also depressed the price quite a bit. The era of this mansion is Victorian, named that because it was built during the reign of Queen Victoria, which lasted from 1837 to 1901. And the real estate listing, plus a few other websites online that I could find about this house, classify it as a Victorian Gothic style. But I don't know, I kind of disagree. I'm not at all an expert in architecture, but let me tell you why I think this house is a mix of High Victorian Gothic, High Victorian Italianate, and Second Empire. And if you disagree, I would love to hear your take in the comments. All right. So here is my beef with calling this house simply Victorian Gothic. It definitely has features of that style, for sure, but the main features you'd associate right off the bat with a Gothic revival style are always going to be peaked arches or peaked windows and some sort of tracery elements, which this house has neither. What it does have from later Victorian Gothic architecture, or as it's called, High Victorian Gothic, is high contrast colors, in this case, the white trim and the dark blue siding, and grouped colonnettes, which just means that it has these very slender columns placed in groups rather than alone, which is what we have all the way across the front of the porch. Okay, so why High Victorian Italianate? First off, all of the building material. High Victorian Gothic buildings were more commonly made out of heavy, chunky looking masonry, and Italianate buildings were more commonly wood-clad. The most distinctive features of High Victorian Italianate designs are all present here. We've got an overall emphasis on height, deep eaves with really chunky decorative brackets and cornices, which look almost oversized in comparison to the building. We've got the stilted, segmented arches, evident on most of the front windows and the front archway. This just means that the straight legs of the arch are skinnier than the arch bit, and the arch bit itself isn't a complete semicircle. And any ornamentation on this is small scale. So this would be stuff like small carved details on the columns or pediments above the windows, for example. But that's not all. Yes, it's got design details of a Gothic revival. I mean, barely, but sure, they're there. And a lot of features from an Italianate revival. But can we really ignore the mansard roof? It's a classic design detail of Second Empire styles. The roof of this house is straight up textbook Second Empire. It's got the mansard roof, it's got a prominent tower, and it's got tons of dormers. Listing this style separate from Victorian Italianate, though, is kind of cheating. Domestic Second Empire architecture, especially in the United States, takes a lot of design notes from the Italianate style, so saying a house is Italianate and Second Empire is almost redundant, and you'd probably just call it Second Empire. So, after running through all of those thoughts on what this house even is, I guess I'd settle on calling it Second Empire with some high Victorian Gothic elements. Keeping all of those important design points in mind, there were a couple of things I really wanted to include. The mansard roof, obviously that's required, but I also wanted to keep the tower a taller height than the rest of the third floor. How I did this was I made the third floor functionally non-existent, but what I did was I made the tower itself a real room, and then the rest of the third floor a platform raised to slightly below the height of the tower walls. And then to complete the mansard roof look, I placed one-sided hipped roof pieces all the way around the perimeter of the platform. Victorian houses can be a straight-up pain in the butt to roof, as they often have very complicated roofscapes, but aside from not having any dormer options I liked, I think this roofline was surprisingly doable in The Sims. When I was recording this build, I was torn between trying to match the rooms to all of the photos of the interior I could find online, which would have made for fantastic comparison screenshots, but in the end I just couldn't. I had to go back and clutter the place up to an almost absurd degree, because if I'm building a Victorian mansion, I've got to furnish it like a Victorian mansion, which means tons of clutter. Like, if you're decorating a Victorian build and you think to yourself, yes, this is certainly enough junk on this end table, I urge you to keep going. Keep cluttering until you feel your sanity slipping. Okay, maybe not that far, but here, I did manage to find one photo of the interior of this place that was taken when the original family was still living there. And you can see what I mean. So much stuff. The Victorians generally had a very eclectic sort of interior design style, and this knick-knack intensive design philosophy really kicked into high gear around the late 1800s, when antique collecting started to become much more widespread. It's kind of a weird concept to consider, but antiques, as we know them today, objects to be collected and revered with historic value, was not always a thing, and is in fact a very recent thing. Not to say that people before this didn't collect and appreciate old things, but it wasn't like a market until very recently. The beginning of the Victorian period was when antique collecting started to become a thing. Before this, old things were super cheap because they were, old. But starting around the early 1800s, people started appreciating antiques, and I don't know if this newfound appreciation drove the eclectic mishmash styles, combining everything from Gothic Revival to chinoiserie, or if the popular styles at the time drove the antique market, maybe a bit of both. But either way, the newly invented hobby of antiquing explains a lot of why the heck these houses have so much crap in them. This was also coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, the time that art collecting, not just of antiques, but also contemporary works of art, was becoming super popular, mostly due to the rise of public exhibitions and the creation of the art dealer as a promoter and entrepreneur. Additionally, probably not at all coincidentally, this was an absolute boom time for both museums and auction houses. Auction houses were getting a lot of business at this time from a couple of economic crashes, which caused some great aristocratic loot to go up on the auction block. So yeah, long story short, all of that basically adds up to Victorian houses containing a lot of stuff because Victorians wanted to collect a lot of stuff. While I'm furnishing here, I want to point out that Victorian homes, especially in the late 1800s when this particular house was built, would have had some extremely exciting features. For one thing, there was some technological advances that made oil lamps burn brighter and give off less smoke. Oil lamps transitioned from natural oils like olive oil or palm oil to paraffin oil, which is distilled from coal, and it was also around this time that you start seeing those fancy lampshades with the beaded fringe. It was also around this time that gas lights become more common. Gas was way brighter, but produced a lot of soot and fumes, so it was mostly only used in the downstairs living areas, but when the incandescent gas lamps were introduced in the 1880s, that made gas much more attractive as it was less gross to operate. Surprisingly, gas lighting was also available in some areas to working classes. Another riveting development of domesticity is indoor plumbing. Yep, we've got indoor plumbing, folks. Bathrooms with plumbing started to become a standard feature in middle and upper class homes in the 1800s. And these bathrooms were pretty much exactly how we would expect a bathroom to look today. Ceramic tiled floors and walls, porcelain sink, tub, and toilet. Admittedly, the early Victorian bathrooms were a little bit sketchy, not so sanitary, a lot of wood and mold growth opportunities, because early on, they just converted a bedroom or a dressing room into a bathroom, so those rooms would have wood floors, wallpaper, and wood trim. But thankfully, the people saw the light toward the end of the century, perhaps partly due to the Prince of Wales having a really bad case of typhoid and blaming it on bad plumbing. But then there was this whole movement to make bathroom spaces in particular more hygienic. As a funny little aside, in the earlier days of indoor plumbing, more toward the mid-1800s, the middle-class people were all way excited and totally on board with indoor plumbing, while the rich upper-crust folk were all pretty skeptical because, of course, they were happy to have their servants still continue to haul water around their palaces for them. But I think even the uber-rich can appreciate doing away with chamber pots. By the 1870s, sewage systems and advances in piping methods made indoor toilets pretty much as we know them today. So this house, built in 1882 to an upper-class family, would have had all of the modern features of today's bathrooms, except toilet paper. Yes, tragically, toilet paper wouldn't be invented for another 50 years, so I hope they stocked up on newspapers and mail order catalogs. We're coming up to the end of the build, but stick around to the very end for some glamour shots. I hope you've liked this build. I really love how the exterior turned out, and let me know in the comments if you have any building or architecture style requests. I have been loving the ideas I've gotten so far. Trust me, they're all on a giant list of build ideas I keep. And if you're interested in art, architecture, and history, please consider subscribing. I have many more of these videos planned, and thank you so much for watching.